I never thought I'd be cleaning the hallways of a psychiatric hospital in the middle of the night, especially one as notorious as Blackwood Asylum. The ad for the janitorial position had seemed almost too good to be true. Graveyard shifts, barely anyone around, and the pay was shockingly high for such menial work. I'd never been the type to ignore red flags. But with my rent overdue, my car threatening to be repossessed, and medical bills piling up faster than I could pay, it felt like desperation made every questionable offer look like salvation. They'd warned me during the interview about the isolation, the old infrastructure, and the kind of rules that had driven other employees out within weeks. I nodded, convinced that none of that mattered. Money talked, and in my case, it screamed. The drive to Blackwood was unsettling even before I reached the gates. A winding road cut through dense forest, the kind of place where the moon barely penetrates the canopy. And every shadow seemed alive. The trees arched overhead, like they were conspiring, their gnarled branches scraping against each other with every gust of wind. Even before the asylum came into view, I felt the kind of tension that sits in your chest and refuses to leave. It was old, terribly old. The kind of place built in a time when psychiatric hospitals were fortresses designed to keep not just patients in, but everyone out. Black stone walls towered over the surrounding forest, and narrow, slit-like windows gave the impression of being watched from every corner. When I pulled up to the front, a woman in her 60s with steel gray hair and a tightly wound bun met me at the doors. Mrs. Holloway, the night supervisor, had a presence that made the hair on my neck rise. She didn't smile. She didn't make small talk. She handed me a laminated ID badge, a key card, and a thin sheet of paper with the hospital's night shift rules printed in bold, all caps lettering. "You'll find these helpful," she said flatly, her eyes scanning me as if assessing whether I'd be a liability or an asset. "Follow them to the letter. Ignore them at your own risk." I tried to hide my unease as I slid the badge around my neck and tucked the rules into my back pocket. The paper felt heavier than it should have, the laminated surface cold and slick in my hand. Mrs. Holloway gestured toward the shadowed corridors behind her. "Your route covers the main floors, patient wards, and the basement supply areas. You'll see Duchenne tonight. She'll guide you if needed. Keep quiet, keep your head down. Invisible, and you'll last." I swallowed, feeling a knot in my stomach. I nodded, murmured my thanks, and stepped into the hallway. The sound of my shoes squeaking against the worn linoleum echoed like gunshots in the empty corridors. Every sound, every drip of water from the ceiling, seemed amplified, reverberating through the skeletal halls. I began my first round methodically, pushing the mop bucket ahead of me, wiping down surfaces, and emptying trash cans with mechanical precision. The fluorescent lights above buzzed constantly, flickering intermittently, casting long quivering shadows across the walls. Occasionally, I'd hear a patient cough or mutter behind a closed door, but mostly the hospital was silent, a cavernous tomb of hums, whispers, and the occasional creak of a floorboard beneath unseen waiter weight. Duchesne, my floor supervisor, appeared only twice that night. Once to nod in acknowledgement as she passed, and once to remind me with a sharp edge to read the rules completely before the end of my shift. I nodded again, tucking the admonishment into a corner of my mind while continuing the work. The rules themselves were cryptic in tone, but mundane on the surface. Don't bother the patients, keep noise to a minimum, don't touch anything that isn't yours. There were 7 in total, and I didn't bother memorizing them. I assumed foolishly that they were just the kind of workplace instructions you ignore at first and internalize later. But Blackwood had a way of teaching lessons in ways you'd never expect. By my 3rd week, I'd fallen into a rhythm. The monotony of the night and the mechanical labor offered a strange kind of meditation. I stopped noticing the faint musty smell that permeated the halls, or the way the air felt thicker in the east wing, or how shadows seemed to linger longer than they should. I told myself it was my imagination. I told myself the building was old, and old buildings always feel haunted. I told myself anything to keep the creeping fear from becoming a paralyzing weight. It was a Thursday when the rules first made themselves known in ways I couldn't ignore. I'd run out of bleach, and the supply closet on the 2nd floor was locked. Duchesne was nowhere to be found, her radio silent. My choices were limited. Wait, skip the cleaning, or use my keycard to access the basement supply area that Mrs. Halloway had warned me about. I descended the stairs, each step creaking ominously, the temperature dropping sharply with every level I passed. The basement smelled of stale air, industrial cleaner, and something else, something organic and unsettling. My breath fogged in front of me, thick clouds of condensation that seemed too tangible to be natural. At the end of the basement corridor, I noticed a door I hadn't seen before. Unlike the peeling wooden doors and warped metal I was used to, this door was reinforced steel, modern and foreboding. A keypad lock gleamed under the faint emergency light, and a small observation window caught my eye. I hesitated, heart hammering, but something about the door pulled me forward. My keycard bounced against my chest as I approached, every instinct screaming to turn back. but curiosity, that most dangerous of urges, propelled me onward. Through the observation window, I saw her, sitting perfectly still in the faint blue emergency light. A woman, impossibly old, her skin like brittle paper, her white hair sparse and frail, wearing a hospital gown. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, and her eyes, wrong eyes, locked onto mine. They weren't just old or damaged. They were too aware, too present. I felt the weight of them pressing into my skull. And then I heard her voice, not through the door, not through the window, but directly in my mind. "Hello, Tyler." My knees buckled. I slammed into the opposite wall, gasping for air as cold dread slithered down my spine. She smiled, a chilling, unnatural expression. "You have kind eyes," her voice whispered inside my head. "Like your mother. She has cancer, doesn't she? The bad kind. You're working here to pay for her treatments." Every word was precise, intimate, and impossibly invasive. My mind scrambled for reason, for any explanation. But the reality of her presence, of her awareness, of her impossible connection, pressed in on me from all sides. I couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't think. The hospital around me faded into background noise. The humming lights, the squeaking floors, the sterile smell, all irrelevant compared to the absolute, suffocating presence of her gaze. She raised one hand and pressed it against the glass. I felt pressure where there should have been none, a force that made my forehead ache. "You should read your rules," she said softly, almost kindly. "I think you've broken quite a few tonight." And in the condensation on the glass, letters formed backward, visible only to me. "Read your rules." I stumbled backward, abandoning my mop, my keycard, my carefully maintained composure. I ran without thinking, my footsteps echoing through corridors, my lungs burning, the fluorescent lights flickering as if warning me to stop. Somewhere behind me, I imagined her laughter, soft and distant, echoing in the chambers of my mind. Every instinct screamed to flee, yet every part of me knew I could never leave. Not really. I had broken the rules, and now Blackwood was aware. I had become a part of it, a link in its long dark chain. By the time I reached the lobby, my hands shaking and eyes wild, the hospital was silent once again, ordinary in its emptiness. Mrs. Holloway's office lights were off. Dushan's radio remained silent. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. The rules, the warnings, the cryptic 7 instructions. They were no longer mere words. on a laminated sheet. They were laws of survival, and I had already transgressed them. I collapsed against the wall, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. Each shadow seemed to twitch, each creak of the building amplified. Every scent made my stomach churn. I realized with a sinking certainty that Blackwood was not just a building, not just a workplace, but a living entity with rules older and more binding than any human authority. And I, by my arrogance and desperation, had become entangled in its design. I don't know how long I stayed there, pressed against the cold wall, but when I finally dared to look up, the lobby was empty, normal, and yet not. The key card around my neck felt heavier, as if weighing down my soul. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the core, that my nights at Blackwood would never be ordinary again. Every corridor, every patient, every shadow had become a reminder. There are rules to follow. Some rules, once broken, reach beyond the paper they are written on, stretching into the very walls and the dark corners of your mind. The next night, I returned to Blackwood with a sense of dread that made each step feel heavier than the last. I couldn't shake the memory of the woman in the basement, her impossible eyes, and the whisper of my mother's illness threading through my skull. Every instinct screamed that I should quit, leave, run as far from this place as possible. But the pay was still obscene for a janitor's job, and the bills didn't care about fear. They kept piling up. Reminders that survival often required compromising dignity and sometimes sanity. So, with a knot in my stomach, I swiped the keycard and stepped inside, pretending to be unaffected, pretending to be invisible, just like Duchesne had instructed. From the moment I began my rounds, the building seemed different. The east wing, where the lights flickered most violently, felt oppressive, almost as if the walls were breathing. I noticed small things that I hadn't before. A shadow that lingered a heartbeat too long. A faint hiss behind the peeling wallpaper. A smell like scorched paper wafting from an empty room. My gloves felt sticky, though nothing was wet, and the mop seemed to resist my push as if some invisible force wanted me to stop. The rules hummed in the back of my mind, like a distant chant I couldn't understand, but somehow knew I had ignored. I decided to finish the first floor wards before the second floor. A simple precaution to keep my mind occupied. The patients' rooms were mostly dark, with the occasional flicker of a television casting pale blue light on the walls. Some murmured in their sleep, and others shifted in their beds as if dreaming of distant horrors. It was all ordinary, yet I felt the weight of being watched in a way that had nothing to do with the patients themselves. The air pressed down on me, thick and humid, smelling of bleach, decayed paper, and the faint, indefinable metallic scent that seemed to grow stronger as I moved toward the end of the hall. When I reached the stairwell leading down to the basement, a sudden shiver ran down my spine. I told myself it was just nerves, residual fear from the previous night. But as I pressed the button to open the stairwell door, I noticed something that stopped me cold. The small keypad on the basement door blinked, a single green light flashing insistently. And then, impossibly, numbers began appearing on the keypad without my touch, like invisible fingers punching in a code. I stepped back, heart racing, but curiosity, stubborn and dangerous, forced me closer. Before I could decide, the door clicked open, slowly swinging inward on its rusted hinges. The basement air hit me first, cold, stale, and with that same faint sweetness that hinted at decay and preservation all at once. My breath fogged in the dim light, and each step echoed against the concrete walls. I should have turned back. I knew I should have. But something pulled me deeper, a gravitational force rooted not in my body, but in my mind. The hallway stretched ahead, narrow and oppressive, lined with rusting shelving and stacks of crates that seemed far older than the building itself. Shadows pooled in every corner, shifting as though alive. And then I saw her again, sitting exactly where I'd left her, in the faint blue glow of the emergency light, hands folded in her lap. The eyes, impossibly aware, impossibly knowing, found mine instantly. I froze. My pulse thundered, my chest tight with fear. She didn't move beyond the slow, deliberate rotation of her head, a doll-like motion that made the air in the room tremble. Her voice, calm and precise, invaded my mind again. "You didn't read the rules, Tyler." It was not accusatory, but it carried a weight far heavier than any reprimand could. It was a sentence, a verdict, a promise. I wanted to explain, to say I forgot, that I didn't know, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't form. My tongue felt thick, as if the very air conspired to silence me. "Why are you here?" I finally managed, my voice a whisper swallowed by the basement's oppressive darkness. Her lips curved into that unsettling, knowing smile. "Because you were always meant to be," she said. "Because the rules exist for a reason. Because someone must carry the bridge. You, Tyler, have become a conduit." I didn't understand, couldn't understand, but my instincts screamed that understanding didn't matter. Compliance mattered, survival mattered. Yet the bridge she mentioned twisted in my mind, a concept too abstract and terrifying to grasp fully. I could feel a pull, like invisible threads connecting me to her, to the building, to something older, deeper, alive. I backed toward the stairs, feeling the tiles beneath my shoes transform into a slick, unnerving surface. The shadows seemed to elongate, reaching for me, whispering in voices just below comprehension. I stumbled, catching myself against a crate, and glanced at the shelves. Objects shifted, boxes subtly sliding, tins rattling softly. Nothing should have moved, and yet everything did. It was a subtle motion, enough to make me question reality itself. "Do you feel it?" she asked, her voice again inside my skull. I nodded, even though she couldn't see it. Her eyes gleamed sharp and piercing, yet calm. Good. That is the first test. Every rule you ignore weakens the boundary. You saw the door last night. You will see more tonight, but only if you survive. A cold draft swept through the corridor, extinguishing the faint emergency light briefly, plunging the hallway into blackness that seemed to thrum with anticipation. My fingers clutched the railing tightly, knuckles white. I wanted to run, but even the act of moving seemed to require effort beyond the physical, as though the building itself resisted. I noticed a small metal cart tucked against the wall, rusted and forgotten. On it sat a stack of old documents, yellowed and curling at the edges. The top sheet bore instructions, scrawled in a hand that seemed impossibly deliberate. The rules must be observed. Any deviation invites observation. The letters shimmered faintly in the dim light, as if alive. I felt a pang of understanding. The rules were not merely guidelines. They were binding to the mind, to the body, to the very essence of those who worked here. I turned my attention back to her, expecting movement, confrontation, something tangible. She remained seated, serene, a guardian of impossible knowledge. Yet her presence filled the space, pressing against my awareness in a way that made rational thought nearly impossible. I could hear my own heartbeat, a frantic drum, echoing unnaturally through the basement. And then, faintly, I heard whispers. Not her voice, but many voices, layered, urgent, incomprehensible. They seemed to rise from the walls, from the floor, from nowhere and everywhere at once. I stumbled to the stairs, climbing with trembling hands and knees. The whispers followed, ebbing and flowing, sometimes clear enough to make me flinch. Observe, follow, survive. One phrase repeated with alarming insistence, though I could not be certain if it was real or imagined. By the time I reached the first floor, the hallway seemed longer than I remembered. Shadows pooling and stretching like sentient things. The fluorescent lights buzzed with increasing intensity, as though reacting to my presence. I returned to the ward areas to finish my route, but each task felt monumental. The mundane work, emptying trash, mopping floors, wiping counters, had become a ritualistic test of endurance. Each step I took was measured, careful, wary of unseen observation. I realized with a creeping horror that Blackwood was no ordinary asylum. It was an entity, patient and calculating, and I was now a participant in its tests. The rules were its language, its will, and my survival depended on interpreting them correctly. Somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought about quitting, about calling in sick, disappearing from the asylum forever. But the bridge she mentioned, the pull of the rules, and the financial reality of my life rendered the thought hollow. The building did not merely want obedience, it demanded attention, awareness, connection, and I had already stepped into that web. By the third week, the weight of the rules began to feel physical, pressing against me in ways I couldn't fully explain. Each night, I approached my route with a mixture of dread and obsession, my mind constantly reviewing the laminated sheet tucked in my back pocket. I knew I hadn't read all of them thoroughly, and every step through Blackwood reminded me of that negligence. The building seemed alive, observing, anticipating my mistakes, and I felt as though every creak, every humming light, every flickering shadow carried judgment. I began to notice subtle changes in the patients. Nothing overt, no screams or strange outbursts, but small things. A patient who always slept on the left side of the bed now shifted to the right, murmuring numbers in a rhythm I couldn't comprehend. A shadow that seemed to lean just slightly toward me from a corner where no light reached. A faint cold breeze brushing past my ear when no door or vent was open. At first, I rationalized these as fatigue, stress, paranoia, the natural side effects of 10-hour night shifts under fluorescent lights that never truly warmed. But deep down, I knew it was more. Blackwood was responding to me, testing me, and the rules were its instruments. The worst night came when I ran out of cleaning supplies again. I had double-checked my route, calculated exactly what I would need, and still, some unseen hand or some malicious coincidence had ensured that I was unprepared. Duchesne was nowhere to be found, and my radio crackled with static as if the asylum itself refused to allow communication. I descended the stairs to the basement, keycard in hand, and felt the oppressive chill press against my bones. The door at the end of the hallway awaited me, metal gleaming under the pale emergency light, keypad blinking with quiet insistence. I hesitated longer than I should have. Last time, the woman had been there, her gaze pulling at my mind like gravity. I could feel her presence, cold and expectant, even before I reached the door. And yet I stepped forward, keycard in hand, heart hammering, fingers trembling. When the door clicked open, the air that met me was thick with anticipation. The smell of old paper, industrial cleaner, and something organic and indefinable invaded my senses. The shadows seemed to stretch, moving independently, curling around crates and shelves, as though the darkness itself had become sentient. She was there, of course, sitting perfectly upright, hands folded, eyes impossibly aware. Her smile, the same unnerving, knowing curve of her lips, greeted me before I even spoke. "You're back," she said, in that voice that invaded my skull directly, bypassing ears, throat, and tongue. "You ignored the rules again." I didn't mean to," I stammered. My voice sounded small, weak, foolish even to my own ears. But she wasn't listening to my words. She never did. She was listening to my intent, my hesitation, the fear pooling in my chest like a tangible thing. "That is exactly why you must pay attention," she said, each word deliberate, heavy with authority. "Blackwood notices, Blackwood adjusts. You are connected, Tyler. And connections are delicate. They must be maintained. Broken bridges are dangerous." The words chilled me to the bone. Bridges. I thought back to her first night when she had described me as a conduit. I was the link, the bridge. It had seemed abstract then, terrifying, but incomprehensible. Now, I understood in pieces. Every action, every decision, every step was being monitored and evaluated. The rules were not suggestions. They were not guidelines. They were contracts, ancient and binding, enforced by something beyond human understanding. I attempted to move past her, to reach the supplies I needed. But the basement seemed to elongate, corridors stretching, shadows pooling at impossible angles. My keycard felt impossibly heavy against my chest, like a talisman binding me in place rather than granting access. And then she spoke again, softer this time, almost coaxing. "You skipped Rule 4 last night." I froze. I hadn't even read Rule 4. My memory of the laminated sheet had faded into the back of my bag, and I had no idea what it contained. Panic clawed at me. I didn't know," I whispered. "You will learn," she said, and her gaze locked on mine with terrifying precision. "Every deviation has consequences. Every rule ignored allows Blackwood to expand its influence through you. Do not underestimate it. It is patient, but relentless." The walls seemed to close in slightly, not physically, but perceptually. Every shelf, every crate, every shadow loomed with new menace. And yet, I couldn't look away from her. Her eyes penetrated beyond the visible, reaching into my memories, my thoughts, the private corners of my life, my mother's illness, my bills, the desperate choices I had made. All of it laid bare. She had no need for explanation. She simply knew. I reached for the bleach, trembling, trying to maintain some semblance of control. The container was heavier than it should have been, as though infused with the building's weight and expectation. I poured it into the mop bucket with careful precision, each motion feeling like a ritualistic act. I couldn't afford another mistake. Not tonight. Not ever. "You are learning," she said softly, almost approvingly. "But awareness alone is not enough. You must observe. You must follow. You must respect the boundaries. The rules exist not to punish, but to preserve. Blackwood is older than you can imagine, Tyler. Older than anyone alive. And it is not content with passive observation. It requires compliance. It requires vigilance." Her words pressed against my consciousness, and I felt a shiver of dread coil around my spine. Every instinct screamed that this was not just a building, not just a workplace. It was a living entity with consciousness, memory, and power. The patients were minor components, shadows of the rules themselves. The night staff, like me, were instruments, conduits, vessels through which the asylum maintained its influence. I glanced at the hallway, the exit just beyond my reach. I realized that leaving, even temporarily, was impossible. Not because the doors were locked, not because the key cards were required, but because the building itself resisted. Blackwood had recognized me. It had marked me. I was no longer just a janitor. I was a participant in a game whose rules I had only begun to comprehend. The night dragged on. my rounds now a blend of mundane labor and constant vigilance. I observed shadows, sounds, even the faintest changes in air pressure with the precision of a soldier in hostile territory. Every sound that had once been background noise became significant. Every flicker of light, every cough, every whisper seemed to carry messages. And through it all, her presence lingered, not physically, not tangibly, but omnipresent, watching, aware, waiting. I began to understand the subtlety of the rules. They were not merely about conduct or behavior, they were tests of attention, memory, and restraint. Rule 1: keep the environment under observation. Rule 2: do not ignore anomalies. Rule 3: never underestimate the patient's awareness. Rule 4: avoid deviation from prescribed paths. Rule 5: maintain mental clarity. Rule 6: respect boundaries, both physical and unseen. Rule 7: acknowledge the consequences of broken rules. I had violated Rule 4. I had ignored Rule 6. And now, the consequences were tangible in the weight pressing on my mind, in the shadows that seemed to lean closer, in the subtle vibrations running through the floor beneath my feet. Compliance was no longer an option. Survival demanded obedience, attentiveness, and humility. By the time my shift ended, I was exhausted, not just physically, but mentally. Every nerve in my body screamed for rest, yet sleep felt impossible. I had glimpsed the machinery of Blackwood, the delicate, horrifying network of rules and awareness that controlled the asylum, and I had violated it. Even as I left the building, walking through the winding forest road back to my car, I felt the connection persist, the bridge intact, the entity within the walls extending its reach into my very being. I knew that the following nights would be more intense, that the rules would demand more, that observation would become more direct, and I knew with a chilling certainty that Blackwood would not forget my transgressions, nor forgive them lightly. I was tethered now, entwined in a network far beyond my comprehension, and every step I took would be watched, measured, and judged. The next night, I arrived at Blackwood with every nerve taut, my mind a chaotic tangle of fear, anticipation, and obsession. I barely spoke to Duchesne, barely noticed the patients. My focus was on the rules, the 7 laminated commandments that now dictated my every thought. The bridge she had spoken of haunted me. I didn't understand it fully, but I felt its pull, a tether, connecting me to Blackwood, to her, to something older and far beyond human comprehension. I was not just an employee, I was a participant, a test subject, a vessel for observation. As I began my rounds, the shadow seemed to move deliberately, almost sentient. A faint rustling came from behind a wall vent. I stopped, heart hammering, trying to determine if it was a rat, an animal, or something else. The air seemed thicker than usual, more oppressive, and I could feel eyes on me from every corner, though no one was visible. I realized with growing horror that the building itself was alive, not with machines or wires, but with consciousness, ancient and patient. Every rule I had ignored, every lapse in attention had strengthened the connection, the influence, the awareness pressing against my mind. Reaching the basement was inevitable. I knew it, and my legs moved before I could think otherwise. The reinforced door stood at the end of the corridor, keypad blinking. This time, the code seemed to input itself, numbers appearing without my touch. I hesitated, aware that crossing this threshold would bring me face to face with the incomprehensible. The door swung open and I stepped inside. She was waiting, as always. But this time, she stood. The room seemed impossibly larger than before, stretching beyond physical constraints, her presence filling it entirely. Her eyes found mine, and the weight of her gaze was suffocating. "You've returned," she said, voice inside my skull, precise and intimate. "You've been careless. You've ignored the rules. But now, you will see what it means to be connected fully." I wanted to step back, wanted to run, but the building seemed to hold me in place. The shadows stretched, curling around my body, brushing against my skin like invisible fingers. The air pulsed with awareness, anticipation, judgment. My pulse raced, every instinct screaming terror. But I could not look away from her. Her eyes pierced through me, unraveling memories, thoughts, fears. My desperation for my mother, my endless financial struggles, my guilt at ignoring the rules. All of it was laid bare. "You will participate," she said. "The rules are not suggestions. They are life. They are preservation. You must observe fully, follow precisely, and respect the boundaries. You are the bridge, Tyler. You are the conduit. The connection is complete only if you understand and obey." I trembled, nodding, though it felt meaningless. She gestured to the far corner of the room where a shadowy shape coalesced. It was a figure, amorphous yet vaguely human, writhing and shifting. Whispers rose from it. Hundreds of voices layered into a single, incomprehensible chant. My stomach turned, my skin crawled, but I understood. This was the consequence of rule breaking. The entity I had invited by neglect, a fragment of Blackwood itself, made manifest to correct, to enforce. I swallowed hard, recalling the laminated rules. Rule 4, Rule 6. I had violated them. Now the consequences were tangible, palpable. The shadow shifted closer, and I felt a pressure on my mind, an invisible hand inspecting, probing, judging. Every instinct screamed to flee, but my body was anchored by fear and necessity. I had to comply. I had to learn. I had to survive. I took a deep breath and recited the rules aloud, voice quivering. Observe. Do not ignore anomalies. Never underestimate patient awareness. Avoid deviation. Maintain mental clarity. Respect boundaries. Acknowledge consequences. The words felt like a charm, a fragile shield. The shadow paused. Tension in the room palpable. Her eyes softened slightly, approvingly. "You are learning," she said. "But understanding alone is not enough. You must act every moment with attention and care. The bridge must be strong." Then, without warning, she raised her hand again. This time, the glass between us shimmered like water, and I felt the pressure of her touch again, though nothing met my skin. And suddenly, the whispers, the shadows, the oppressive awareness, they receded, leaving only the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the faint smell of old paper. I collapsed, shaking, exhausted, and understood something terrifying and essential. Blackwood never forgives negligence. It never forgets. Every night is a test. Every moment an opportunity to fail. I staggered to the stairs, keycard clutched in my hand, and ascended to the main floors. The patients slept. The shadows receded slightly, yet the weight remained. I had survived the night, but I knew I had not escaped. Every corner of the building, every corridor, every flickering light and whispering shadow was part of the network that connected me to Blackwood and to her. I was tethered now, permanently. A janitor, not just of floors and trash, but of the invisible architecture of the asylum itself. By the time dawn began to creep over the forest outside, I was alone in the lobby, breathless, sweat and fear mingling. The building appeared ordinary once more. The corridors quiet, the shadows settling into familiar shapes. But I knew the truth. It was a lie. Blackwood never rested, and neither would she. The rules, laminated and unassuming in my pocket, had taken on a terrifying weight. They were not just words, they were contracts, they were lifelines. And I had learned the hard way that breaking them brought not just punishment, but exposure to forces that understood every fear, every secret, every weakness. I left the building that morning, physically intact but profoundly altered. Every night henceforth, every step through the dim corridors, every flicker of light, every shadowed corner became a test of obedience, attention, and endurance. And in the recesses of my mind, I understood the cruelest truth. I would never truly leave Blackwood, not in body, not in mind. I was part of it now, forever connected, a bridge, a conduit. Even now, as I speak these words, writing them down in the hope someone, somewhere, might understand, I can feel her watching. I can feel the building observing, and I know with absolute certainty there are rules to follow, and breaking them invites consequences beyond comprehension. I am a janitor at Blackwood Asylum. I follow the rules. I survive. But the bridge is real, and she is waiting.